We're going to be talking about when a Jew dies, and the purpose of this is to take a particular group, in this case the Jews, look at its practices, look at their practices in response to death and its aftermath, and see if we can learn something about the general phenomenon by looking at the particular. In a way, this is an extension of what we have done already by looking at a variety of practices in our previous section. And we're going to continue to look at a variety of practices in this section. To begin with, we can say that profound mourning carries with it many of the characteristics of a deep melancholic response. Profound mourning is an emotional state of being that leads to the same feelings of loss of interest in the outside world and an inability to move beyond the object of love that one was attached to. These are both concerns for society. A loss of interest in the outside world, which a mourner experiences, of course, is critical to society because society does represent the outside world, the world outside of one's personal domain. And the inability to adopt a new object of love in place of the one that was lost to death is also a concern of society because society wants us to be able to move on. In fact, what we see is that in many of the practices, there is a recognition in the aftermath of death that the mourner resists turning to anything that does not have a connection with the thought of the dead. And so many of the practices, particularly in the initial onset of death, recognize this inability, give into it, nurture it, but at the same time also seek to control it. That is, the transition from this melancholia, this sadness, this inability to move on, this turning inward, that is given license. It is provided with a framework for expression, but that framework also serves to limit it and to allow people to move on. So, how do we see this? Well, in the Jewish tradition, there are a variety of steps and, in fact, even of roles for mourning. And much of what we're going to be talking about here is not so much the dead person as the people who grieve, the mourners, the bereft. The first category, or the first role that we're going to talk about briefly is, and there isn't really a word for this in English, and so we're going to use the word that comes from the Jewish tradition, and it's called Onen. An Onen is a person who, if we use terms that we've already used in our course, is in a liminal or transitional period. The Onen is the person who is bereaved of the dead, who has lost someone, but who has not yet disposed of the dead. A person becomes an Onen when a relative, one of the core relatives, a father, a mother, a spouse, a child, a brother, a sister, has died. At that moment, the moment when the living person has become deceased, at that moment, these people who have that relationship that I've just described become an Onen. An Onen is when one first is bereaved, grief-struck, but not yet formally in mourning. Mourning can only occur when the dead has been disposed of. Before that disposal, in the first flush of bereavement, one becomes an Onen. And many of the practices and expectations of the Onen are what we want to think about briefly today. The Onen is thrown, no matter who he or she is, into a profound dependence on others. He needs help just as the deceased needs help upon being dead. Somebody has to take care of that body. Somebody has to dispose of it. Somebody has to see to its disposition, burial or otherwise. So the Onen must as well. He must find others. He, I'm using in the generic sense, he or she must find others who can help in this onerous, difficult, emotionally, and very often logistically, task of what do we do with the dead person. We've seen from our reading of Lynch that the emergence of the professional who is the undertaker is a way in which society has said we understand that these needs exist, and we've created a person, a role, a professional who will help you. Because the Onen is in this liminal period, he or she experiences all the risks of liminality. That is, what are the risks? Well, first there are the emotional risks. One of the emotional risks we've already seen, which is the centrifugal force, being thrown into chaos, the loss of interest in the world outside, the loss of being able to move on. The Onen is expected to be overwhelmed by grief. One of the ways of thinking about it is that the person becomes unhinged. Now, unhinged has a whole series of meanings. Unhinged means that he is disconnected from the person who's died, disconnected from the rest of the world, and unhinged is also a psychological way of thinking about somebody who, in a sense, loses his or her mind. Society, when someone becomes thus unhinged, tries immediately to hinge us, to moor us, to stabilize us. It does this by giving us lots of things to do. So one of the important characteristics in Jewish law and Jewish tradition and Jewish practice is to find things for the Onen to do. That means telling the Onen that all your other responsibilities, things that have nothing whatsoever to do with the dead, those you can drop. In fact, not only can you drop, you have so much to do in dealing with the disposal of this dead person that all the other things, not only are you released from doing, but you may not do. Your primary responsibility is to figure out how to prepare the corpse. And as we'll see, preparing the corpse requires turning it from something impure into something pure. It also recognizes us, the bereft, as being in limbo. So both the grief-struck and the corpse are in limbo, in an in-between state, not ready for the full brunt of the public. They're both in a kind of transitional staging area. We don't visit the Onen, just as we don't visit the deceased body before the funeral. That is, in a sense, all of this, and now we're talking about Jewish tradition, is that we can't count on either of them now. The dead person we can no longer count on, and we can no longer count on the involvement of the Onen. They are both busy, yet not fully engaged. With others, but also very alone. For them, life is plural. It has multiple realities. We cannot ignore the changes that occur in this liminal period. This is not like any other transitional period.